Okay, thank you very much. Our second paper is going to be presented by Zoe Egelman, who graduated from Yale University in 2013 with a Bachelor of Arts in French Literature. She worked with Alice Kaplan on a senior thesis on Hélène Berr, and also with numerous fellowships, spent months in Paris doing research at the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine, and she has also worked with Henri Rousseau on an article in the journal Conserverie Mémoriale. Zoe is currently working in the New York District Attorney's Office as she prepares to go to law school to study human rights and criminal law, in part motivated by this work that she's done. Today she'll be speaking about Hélène Berr. The paper is entitled The Journal of Hélène Berr and the Promise of Literature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From April 1942 through February 1944, from ages 21 to almost 23, Hélène Berr kept a diary of her daily life in Paris under the occupation. Little by little, she made sense of the Statut des Juifs, the roundups, the internment camps, the deportations, and the concentration camps. A highly promising student of English literature at the Sorbonne, Hélène was born and raised to a wealthy French-Jewish family in Paris's 7th arrondissement, in an apartment on the Champ de Mars overlooking the Eiffel Tower. She could not have predicted the fate that would befall her, her family, her acquaintances, her friends, and the Jews in Paris. Hélène was arrested with her parents at their family home in February 1944 and died the following year in Bergen-Belsen. After 1944, Hélène's diary was first in the possession of the Berr family cook, then for 50 years with Jean Morawiecki, Hélène's boyfriend while she wrote the diary, and to whom Hélène dedicated her work, and finally with Mariette Job, Hélène's niece, before she gave the manuscript to the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris in 2002. Slide, please. Thank you. The diary was first published in France in 2008. In this paper, I want to speak about how we understand Hélène Berr as a woman who participated in some form of the resistance. I will first address Hélène's decision to stay in Paris during the occupation and her decision to work for the Union Générale des Israélites de France, or the UGIF. Since my background is primarily in literature, I will then focus my study on the degree to which we can understand Hélène's diary itself, and within it, her commitment to literature as perhaps acts of resistance. It is difficult to fully comprehend why Hélène stayed in Paris during the occupation. She certainly had the means to leave before it was too late. Her sister Yvonne and her brother Jacques had already left for the free zone by the time Hélène's diary opens in 1942. But it's possible that her sense of identity kept her in Paris. Hélène was fully integrated into French society and culture, a member of the French intellectual and economic elite. Her family, Ashkenazi on her father's side and Sephardic on her mother's, had been in France since before the Revolution, and she descended from a line of highly successful engineers. The warning signs, however, were glaring by June of 1942, when Hélène was forced to begin wearing the yellow star and when, a few weeks later, her father was arrested and sent to Drancy. On July 2nd, 1942, Hélène reflected on what it would mean to leave Paris. To leave. My response to the idea was an abrupt feeling of annihilation, and then a feeling of revolt. After thinking about it a bit this evening, I think that I am being selfish, that I do not want to sacrifice my own happiness, because every kind of happiness I have ever felt is concentrated in the life I have here. But I can tell myself to do it. I can force myself to make this sacrifice, but there is more to it than that. There is also giving up a sense of dignity if I agree to go away and join those who have already left. There is also giving up that sense of heroism and struggle that you feel here. There is also giving up the feeling of equality and resistance if I agree to stand apart from the struggle of other Frenchmen. She wrote about her commitment to sharing the struggle with her fellow Frenchmen, for Hélène fully identified first and foremost as French, not as Jewish. She frequently uses the words heroism and struggle as she writes about staying in Paris. Hélène's reflection on this decision are numerous and can be found throughout the diary. Was staying in Paris for Hélène synonymous with resistance or with blindness? David Bellows, who wrote the afterword to the English edition of the diary, calls the diary, quote, a precious and perhaps unique record of denial of Hélène's initial unwillingness to see what was staring her in the face. Perhaps initially, yes, but over the course of the diary, Hélène sees with increasing and remarkable clarity the reality before her eyes. Her complex and penetrating reflections on her motivations to stay in Paris beg us to avoid hindsight and categorical judgment while we read her diary and make sense of her decision not to leave. On July 16th and 17th, 1942, the Vélodrome d'Hiver roundup saw the arrest of more than 13,000 mostly foreign Jews. Hélène wrote the following day, but if we have to leave and abandon the struggle and heroism in exchange for dullness and despondency, no, I'll do something. Hélène's decision to do something involved two activities, volunteering at the Union Générale des Israélites de France and bearing witness in her diary. In July of 1942, during school vacation, Hélène signed up to volunteer at the UGIF. Founded by Vichy in November of 1941 under German orders, the UGIF was run by Jews as an umbrella organization of all Jewish charities that sought to help Jews who had been displaced or imprisoned in internment camps. Through family connections, Hélène personally knew André Berr, vice president of the UGIF, and Armand Katz, secretary general of the UGIF. The organization was responsible for orphanages, correspondence between prisoners and families, provisions for interns, and reuniting families. However, the UGIF was accountable to both the Jews of France and to the Germans, playing a very controversial role in the history of the occupation. Because even if the UGIF did help a significant number of people, the Germans had nonetheless intended the organization to help fulfill its goals. Hélène was aware of this dilemma from the moment she signed up to volunteer with her sister Denise Berr and her sister-in-law Nico Job. She wrote in her diary that day, "We were issued a rather distasteful certificate, referring to the special identity papers that in theory, but not in practice, protected those who worked at the UGIF from arrest and deportation." Hélène continued, "Nicole hasn't stopped being angry about it, saying it's a concession to the Germans. I treat it as the price we have to pay for staying here. It is a sacrifice because I detest all those more or less Zionist movements that unwittingly play into Germans' hands." At the UGIF headquarters in Paris's 8th arrondissement, Hélène helped send packages to internees at Drancy, packaged foodstuffs for impoverished Jews in Paris, and sent letters between internees and their families. All day long, Hélène would witness crying mothers reporting their missing children, fathers who had lost their wives, children who had lost their parents. She opened parcels sent from Drancy filled with the personal possessions of prisoners, rings, keys, watches, even a pair of scissors from a tailor. As much as possible for someone at her low level in the organization, Hélène was relatively aware of the roundups, the deportations, and the conditions in the internment camps. In addition to these administrative responsibilities, Hélène also assumed the exceptionally difficult charge of caring for children in maisons d'enfants whose parents were in internment camps deported to Auschwitz or had entrusted the UGIF with the protection of their children. Hélène thus participated in the UGIF's clandestine networks, its unacknowledged 6th section, beneath the organization's official cover, which smuggled children to places of safety. She assisted at charities such as those run by the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, incorporated as the 3rd health section of the UGIF, which also operated an illegal network to save Jewish children. Taking care of these orphaned and separated children gave Hélène direct, immediate, and almost daily contact with what she called the, quote, true suffering of Jews in the Paris region. Together with the choices to remain in Paris and to work for the UGIF, Hélène made the active decision to bear witness by writing her diary. In this act, not Hélène's work with the UGIF, is what I want to focus on today. There were a good number of people like Hélène who generously volunteered for the UGIF, but there were very few, however, who left behind the kind of diary that Hélène did. She felt compelled to write so that others would know what she had witnessed. Had she not stayed in Paris and volunteered for the UGIF, Hélène would not have given us this testimony. In October 1943, Hélène asked herself, "For how will humanity ever be healed unless all its rottenness is exposed? How will the world be cleansed unless it is made to understand the full extent of the evil it is doing? A month later, November 1943, she wrote, "This is the enormous drama of our age. Everyone is blind to those being tortured." In volunteering for the UGIF brought Hélène into direct contact with suffering. Reading literature allowed Hélène to comprehend it, and writing her diary to memorialize it. Just as Hélène had signed up to volunteer for the UGIF on July 6, 1942, on October 10, 1943, Hélène made the purposeful decision to keep writing. Hélène had kept a diary long before April 7, 1942, when the published diary begins, but she stopped between November of 1942 and October 1943, almost a whole year. Hélène's first diary entry in 1943 makes it clear that the act of writing was a challenge. At that moment, Hélène turned for inspiration to her favorite writer and subject of her thesis at the Sorbonne, John Keats. She wrote, "I recall, or rather I looked up this evening, a quotation from the beginning of Keats's Fall of Hyperion." Hélène looked up, not simply recalled, these lines from the poem in which Keats affirms that no one can deny him the right to write. She sought out a defense of writing by her favorite poet to give her the courage to continue writing herself. In fact, for Hélène in 1943, literature was also a choice. How could she continue reading and writing when the Sorbonne had all but excluded her? On February 10, 1941, Secretary of State Jacques Chevalier signed an order that henceforth prohibited Jews from taking the agrégation. Jews thus did not have the right to register for or present themselves at this concours, yet they had, in theory, the possibility of attending classes informally as auditors. Though Hélène continued her studies, she no longer felt at home at the Sorbonne, in the world where she had once flourished. The requirement to wear the yellow star and the exclusion from the agrégation alienated her from her classmates and rendered her an outsider. As she invested more and more of herself into helping children at the Maison d'Enfants through the UGIF, she found it increasingly difficult to continue studying at the Sorbonne. In October 1943, she writes about going to class one day. "For a moment, I fell back into the magic kingdom, but I am no longer my whole self in that kingdom. I feel as if I am betraying the new kingdom to which I belong." Reconciling two such contradictory responsibilities seemed impossible. Thus, in 1943, when Hélène recommitted herself to writing her diary, there was a dramatic geographic shift from the nature of the diary in 1942. If the terrain of Hélène's writing in 1942 extended from the Luxembourg Gardens to the hallways of the Sorbonne, in 1943, the space closes in on itself. Her literary imagination relocates to her bedroom and her mind. Not only do her entries become much, much darker, but also on every page, Hélène writes about literature. All this literary activity takes place in her family home. Her bedroom becomes her very own classroom, the writing of her diary an expression of her intellectual activity. In October 1943, Hélène wrote of her books, "Sometimes I suddenly remember that they are there, on my bookshelf, and it is like a warm, bright glow in the enveloping coldness. I know they are there, living proof, and that I will be able to look at them." In the comfort of her bedroom, these books, unlike the people around her, cannot be taken away. Hélène's experience of literature can be understood as a sort of moral elevation, a way by which she preserved her dignity and surrounded herself by beauty in a time of horror. In Face à l'extrême, Tsvetan Todorov discusses the role of reading in concentration camps. He writes that in books, it's not the particular message that is important, but the very existence of beauty that these books embody, and the experience of freedom that one feels in entering into communication with their creators, and thereby with the universal. As Hélène writes her diary, she affirms and preserves her sense of humanity through reading, thereby resisting the degradation and dehumanization of the racism and persecution. At the same time, however, Hélène's diary is fascinating because of the particular messages and themes Hélène extracts from specific texts in order to build her testimony. When Hélène writes about Martin Dugard, Keats, Shakespeare, Shelley, and many others, it was also because they were exceptionally relevant in 1943. Hélène's reading of Roger Martin Dugard's Les Thibauts actually changes the style of her diary. October 25th, 27th, and 30th of 1943 are the only days where Hélène copies word for word entire paragraphs from a single book. Les Thibauts, the famous 8-part roman fleuve that Martin Dugard wrote between 1920 and 1939, follows the lives of two brothers, Antoine and Jacques Thibault, from the beginning of the 20th century until the end of World War I. Hélène in her diary reflects deeply on the last two volumes, Summer 1914 and the epilogue, which provide Hélène with a historical perspective that allows her to see with a remarkable clarity and farsightedness that she herself is living through history. On October 25th, 1943, Hélène copies the following passage from the epilogue in which Antoine, wounded, reflects on the war while awaiting his death. Names like the Verdun, Marne, the Somme, pregnant till now with trivially vivid personal associations, were suddenly stripped of immediate reality and became landmarks in a technical epitome, chapter headings in a handbook for the use of history students. This passage concerning the relationship between the present and the future gives Hélène detachment so that she can formulate her own disturbing questions about future writings on her life. She asks, will they ever know how much individual suffering lies behind a single line of any of their speeches? Hélène continues to copy entire passages from Martin Dugard, drawing from the character Antoine Thibault's diary writing in the epilogue. When Hélène recopies passages from Antoine's diary, Hélène's own diary becomes a sort of diary within the diary and illuminates the importance of personal writing for Hélène. She copied this passage from Antoine's diary on October 27, 1943. I have never had the time or the romantic inclination to keep a diary. I regret it. If I could hold between my hands today, in black and white, all my past life since my 15th year, I'd have a better impression of having lived. My life would have specific bulk and form, historical concreteness. It wouldn't be the shapeless, shadowy thing that it is, vague as a half-remembered dream. This act of writing allows Hélène to give her life a historical concreteness amid the uncertainty of 1943. Even more central to Hélène's writing is the British romantic John Keats, whose poetry, life, and letters find their way into Hélène's diary more than any other writer. Keats, the subject of Hélène's thesis, must have been of particular interest to Hélène in 1943. The following is what Louis Casamien, Hélène's professor at the Sorbonne, wrote of Keats in La Poésie romantique anglaise, published in 1939. During that time, where it was common for poets to be young victims, his destiny is perhaps the most touching, for, born for joy, he had to overcome the challenges of each passing day. Born for art, he was never free to forget the most crude anxieties of a menacing existence. And yet his genius, it found itself denied the time given to everyone to be fully realized before death. Such as it exists, his expression is incomplete and immortal. 4 years later, this description would seem duly applicable to Hélène. Despite the many obvious differences in their biographies, Berr, like Keats, demonstrates in her diary a strong appreciation for natural beauty, and the story of a poetic genius confronting death at too young an age, his early 20s, undoubtedly spoke powerfully to Hélène in 1943. Having fallen in love with Jean Morawiecki when she was 21 years old, Hélène may have sensed a parallel with Keats, whose final years were transformed by his love for Fanny Brawne. Sick with tuberculosis, Keats left for Rome in 1820, knowing he might never see Brawne again. On November 26, 1942, Jean Morawiecki left Paris to join the Free French in North Africa. It was Hélène's relationship with Jean while he fought for the Free French that transformed the diary into a work of testimony, which Hélène intended to transmit to Jean should she not be in Paris at the end of the war. Hélène regularly gave the pages of her diary to the Berr family cook, who hid and preserved them before giving them to Jean upon his return. Hélène thus inextricably tied her writing to Jean's own resistance activity. Keats's poetry is engrossed by the thought of his own death, a theme that increasingly dominates Hélène's diary. On October 27, 1943, Hélène copied the Keats poem, This Living Hand. Looking at his hand in the act of writing the poem, Hélène realizes that his hand will end up perhaps soon, in a tomb, but will nevertheless continue to haunt future readers of these immortal verses. By copying this poem into her diary, and ultimately by writing each of her diary entries, Hélène aligns her own immortality with Keats's. After all, a personal diary is a handwritten, not typed document. Hélène holds her diary out to Jean and ultimately to us. There are many other writers who help Hélène express herself. On November 1st, 1943, Hélène reflected on a roundup that had occurred on July 30th of that year at the UGIF headquarters, a day when Hélène was not working. She wrote in her diary, "Such emptiness all around me. For some time after the arrests of July 30th, I had the stressful sensation of being the only survivor of the shipwreck, and a phrase kept jogging and banging around inside my head. It took hold of me without my looking for it. It haunted me. It's a line from the book of Job at the end of Moby Dick. And I alone am escaped to tell thee." When Hélène turns to the words that haunted her from Moby Dick, her voice mingles with that of Ishmael, the sole survivor of the shipwreck. Hélène's reading of Moby Dick is different from our own. She can identify with the character in a very specific way, as she reads her own situation in this famous novel. Just a few pages later, Hélène writes, "The pity of it, Iago, oh Iago, the pity of it, Iago." Hélène draws on these two sentences from Shakespeare's Othello because they dramatically express her pain. For Hélène, literature contained a voice of humanity. The words from these famous texts gave Hélène a voice of authority that intensified her own. Hélène's diary is thus not the expression of a single voice, but rather a chorus. The literary authorities in her bookshelf stood behind Hélène to bear witness to the horror that tormented her. They opened and closed the diary, from Paul Valéry's autograph in the first entry to the 3 words from Shakespeare's Macbeth. On November 24th, 1943, Shelley and Plato became Hélène's advocates. She wrote, "This morning I was reading Shelley and his defense of poetry. Yesterday evening, one of the dialogues of Plato that he translated. How desperate to think that all these magnificent fruits of refinement and humanism, all that intelligence and breadth of mind are dead. To live in times like these and be drawn to all these works is absurd. It's almost incompatible. What would Plato have said? What would Shelley say?" Hélène learned to rely on her books, masterpieces of human reason, which allowed her to see so clearly the incomprehensible barbarity of her day. While many people in Paris remained unaware of the reality, Hélène knew, at the very least, that the great writers of the Western tradition would understand her suffering. In many ways, Hélène saw in them a group of fellow resistors. Thank you.